Welcome back to The Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled you're joining me today because we're going to demystify a topic that is fascinating, highly politicized, and honestly, often totally misunderstood. We're diving deep into the details behind wars for oil. We're going to look past those flashy headlines, dig into our historical sources, and uncover the actual reality of how global conflict and petroleum are connected. So let's just dive right into it.
Right, so we're all familiar with that really popular anti-war slogan, "No blood for oil." It definitely appeals to our conscience, and it operates on this really visceral assumption that spilling blood actually buys a nation cheaper oil. But an economic counter-slogan from our sources flips that completely on its head. It suggests instead, no oil for blood. So the big question we've got to ask ourselves today is this: could you literally spill an ocean of blood and still not make it 1 single cent cheaper to fill up your gas tank? Basically, does blood actually buy oil? Let's find out.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll examine the oil war myth. Then, we'll test our assumptions against 3 major historical case studies: fueling the world wars, the Chaco War illusion, and reassessing the Iraq War. And finally, we'll wrap things up by looking at the future of energy conflicts.
All right, Section 1, the oil war myth, beyond conquest. Let's explore the academic pushback against this super common idea that countries are just constantly invading each other merely to steal petroleum. To start, we kind of need a working definition, right? Broadly speaking, an oil war is a conflict about petroleum resources or their transportation, consumption, or regulation. But here's the absolutely critical distinction. Scholars like Professor Emily Meyerding characterize the literal wars for oil field conquest as, well, largely a myth. She argues that people who push the oil war concept drastically underestimate just how difficult it actually is to seize and exploit foreign oil fields. The whole idea of a direct smash-and-grab heist for oil, it's incredibly rare in modern history. So that brings up a really crucial point. If countries aren't just out there stealing oil, how does it actually cause conflict? Well, political scientist Jeff Colgan outlines 3 complex pathways where oil really does shape modern conflict. First up, we've got ownership and market structure. Think about states trying to alter the global oil industry to suit their own interests, or the risks of market domination. Second is producer politics. This is where massive oil income reduces a petrostate leader's domestic accountability. That makes them way more likely to wage war, or even fund foreign insurgencies. And third, consumer access concerns. This is when nations get caught in tricky security dilemmas just trying to secure global transit routes for their fuel. So you see, it's really not about stealing. It's about this incredibly intricate web of global reliance.
Moving on to Section 2, fueling the world wars, fought with oil.
With that framework in mind, let's shift over to our first historical case study, which is World War II. We're going to see how it wasn't a war for oil in the traditional sense, but it was absolutely the first fully mechanized war fought with and constrained by petroleum. During World War II, there was this massive gap between U.S. production and consumption. Look at the numbers from 1940. The United States was the dominant oil producer by a mile, supplying over 60% of worldwide production. The U.S. was completely energy self-sufficient, and that massive crude surplus, that was literally the underlying foundation for Allied victory. The U.S. actually supplied more than 85% of all the aviation fuel and petroleum used by the Allies. Without that, those mechanized forces would have been completely paralyzed.
Now, let's flip it and look at the Axis powers, who were basically starved for oil. Our sources point out that America's oil embargo against Japan actually helped trigger the attack on Pearl Harbor, because Japan desperately needed to secure its Asian empire for oil. Yet during the attack itself, they made a massive, crucial strategic error. They completely failed to launch a third wave to hit the U.S. oil reserves that were sitting right there. They totally missed their enemy's Achilles heel, and that's exactly what allowed the U.S. Pacific Fleet to recover and keep operating. The Allies knew that if they wanted to stop the Nazi war machine, they had to cut its fuel lines. It was a targeted effort. By late 1943, the Allies were launching intensive air raids on the Romanian oil fields in Plosti. By May of 1944, they were bombing synthetic fuel plants all over Germany. And then, right after the D-Day invasion, on June 8, 1944, General Spaatz issued a formal directive stating that the primary strategic aim of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces was to deny oil to enemy armed forces. And what was the result of all this? Well, by the fall of 1944, the German Luftwaffe had to operate on just 10% of their minimum required aviation gasoline. That lack of fuel literally ground Hitler's offensive to a complete halt. All right, Section 3. The Chaco War Illusion. The War of Thirst.
Let's jump down to South America for our second case study, the conflict between Bolivia and Paraguay from 1932 to 1935. This is a super fascinating example, mostly because it's widely remembered as the quintessential corporate oil war. But here's where popular memory completely clashes with reality. The popular narrative, which is actually still intensely felt today, claims this was a puppet war. The story goes that Royal Dutch Shell backed Paraguay, and Standard Oil backed Bolivia, and they were fighting a proxy war over rich petroleum reserves in the Gran Chaco region. But what's the actual historical reality? Well, historians like Stephen Coate and Matthew Hughes have convincingly shown that there were absolutely no known commercial oil deposits in the disputed region at the time of the conflict. I mean, none. In reality, landlocked Bolivia was fighting a brutal war, which is often called the War of Thirst, just to gain control of a river port that might be navigable to the Atlantic. So it wasn't about oil at all. It was about basic geographic access and water.
Next up, Section 4. Reassessing the Iraq War. Power, not just petroleum. Now we have to turn to the elephant in the room, the highly politicized 2003 Iraq War. We're going to look really closely at what our academic sources say about that famous blood for oil narrative. One of the primary theories used to justify the idea that Iraq was invaded for its oil was actually based on peak oil alarmism. This was a Malthusian premise, popularized by writers like Michael Clare, which basically argued that the United States was rapidly running out of domestic oil and was therefore growing perilously reliant on foreign imports. That resource scarcity panic drove a massive amount of the geopolitical commentary at the time. However, our sources note that geologists and historians have since completely discredited this theory, especially given the huge shale oil boom we later saw in North America. So if this really was an oil war, the obvious academic question is, well, oil for whom? Did it benefit you as consumers? Well, the invasion certainly didn't guarantee cheaper global energy. In fact, it caused massive instability. Okay, did it benefit large oil companies directly? Not really, at least not in the way of direct corporate takeovers that early critics were claiming. And what about the U.S. state? Did it benefit them by securing foreign oil? Scholars who analyze this find almost no tangible link between Iraq's vast reserves and direct benefits for the U.S. state. Think about it. If the goal was simply to get cheap oil, an incredibly costly, destabilizing invasion was arguably the worst possible way to buy it. So if not oil, then what was it? Our sources present an alternative academic argument here. Analysts suggest the invasion was largely driven by a neoconservative effort to project incontestable American geopolitical hegemony. Following the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the 1991 Gulf War, the U.S. was really looking to implant a new ally in a highly volatile region to protect its broader strategic interests. The primary goal was projecting power on a global scale. As one of our sources puts it, any oil obtained along the way was basically just a bonus, rather than the core root cause of the invasion itself.
And finally, Section 5. Future of Energy Conflicts, a Changing Map.
So, we've debunked some major historical myths today. But how will a global transition away from fossil fuels inevitably reshape international conflict going forward? Right now, we know that climate change policies are heavily driving the transition to renewables through things like subsidies, carbon taxation, and emissions trading. But it's not just about the environment. It is absolutely about security. Geopolitical volatility is driving nation-states to realize that relying on foreign energy leaves them hugely vulnerable to actors who might weaponize those energy flows, just like we've seen recently with gas supplies to Europe. To avoid this, countries are racing to build localized, onshore renewable energy grids. They want energy that is completely insulated from global geopolitics.
Which brings us to our final, somewhat provocative thought for today. As we cut our dependence on Middle Eastern oil and transition over to green energy, we have to ask ourselves, will renewable energy actually end energy wars, or is it simply going to redraw the map? Will the global competition just shift away from oil fields and over to the rare earth minerals needed for batteries and solar panels? That's definitely something to ponder as we watch the future of geopolitics unfold. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive in The Explainer. Keep questioning the consensus, and I'll see you next time.